Okay, shall we start? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me welcome all of you to this year's last event organized by the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People under the theme Supporting Human Rights Defenders in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Reality, Challenges, and Obligations. My name is Syed Hasrin, Aidid. I'm the permanent representative of Malaysia to the UN in New York, and I will be moderating the event today. Today's event is being held on WebEx. It is also live streamed on United Nations television. While the representatives of member states will be able to ask their questions in the WebEx platform, the global audience is invited to do so by sending an email to dpr-meeting@un.org. Everyone is also encouraged to tweet the committee hashtag rights for numerical Palestine. For this discussion, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Wesson Ahmad, Director of the Applied Center for International Law of Al-Haq, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, Head of the Jerusalem Office at Amnesty International, Mr. Michael Sfard, Israeli human rights lawyer, and Mr. Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. After the initial introductory remarks by myself on behalf of the committee and the permanent observer of the State of Palestine, I will give the floor to our panelists. After their briefings, we will field questions from the member states and the audience. Please now allow me to say a few words about our committee. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly established the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People to pursue the following main goals. One, promoting a just and peaceful settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and end the Israeli occupation. Two, realizing the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. And three, supporting the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including self-determination, sovereignty, and right to return. We implement our mandate by raising awareness on the question of Palestine through a range of activities, among them events and conferences at UN headquarters here in New York and abroad, a capacity building program for the State of Palestine, and the annual observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on 29 November. As part of its mandate, the committee also engages regularly with civil society organizations in order to keep informed of crucial developments in the occupied Palestinian territory and to mobilize international solidarity and support for Palestinian rights. We are hence deeply concerned by Israel's decision of 22nd October to designate 6 human rights and humanitarian Palestinian CSOs as terrorist organizations. The Bureau of the Committee issued a statement to this effect on 27 October, as did many member states and other entities. We take the opportunity to express again today our solidarity with the 6 organizations and call upon Israel to respect the rights to freedom of association and expression and to rescind this decision. Among these 6 organizations, some are long-standing, reputable, and reliable partners of the committee, as well as the United Nations. This measure follows years of escalating Israeli harassment, intimidation, and obstruction of the work of Palestinian civil society organizations and other human rights actors in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, with raids on their premises, confiscation of files and equipment, and arrest of staff members. The committee is organizing today's event in collaboration with the Observer Mission of Palestine to shed light on the implications of the Israeli decision, on the concerns he exposed, and more broadly, on the work of civil society organizations and human rights defenders in the occupied Palestinian territory, and to underline the role and responsibilities of the international community in the context of the prevailing challenges and shrinking space for Palestinian human rights defenders. I hope that our panel today will help reinforce our support for the work of Palestinian civil society organizations and their freedom of association, opinion, and expression. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is now my honor to ask our colleague Minister Riyad Mansour, permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations in New York, to deliver his remarks. You have the floor, Riyad.
Ambassador Syed Mohamad, my brother, thank you very much, for sharing this encounter with our guests, presenting the different civil society organizations. We are delighted to have them with us, grateful for the committee and for the division for making this event a possibility. And I think that it is very timely to have the representative of the civil society organization, listen to them as we give audience to defend the 6 civil society organizations in Palestine in rejecting characterization by the Israeli occupying authority, which in essence is trying to silence everyone the occupied Palestinian territory and inside Israel would dare to criticize the occupation of Israel. And we had with in the previous segment of this encounter, very productive meeting with Madame Bachelet, the High Commissioner of Rights. And also we respect their principal position in funding civil society organizations, Palestinians, and giving them the necessary space to continue doing the honorable work in defending the human rights of the Palestinians. I am sure that the 4 distinguished panelists presenting different civil society organizations and the large audience who are following us will be able to engage them and learn from them in such a way that we can, all of us, can be able to fund activities and the organization, not only the 6, but all civil society organizations operating in the occupied territory and those in Israel who are defending the human rights of Palestine. I want to welcome you again. And Ambassador Fida is Deputy Permanent Representative of Palestine to the UN, was actively involved, along with other members of my nation, in putting this program together, helping, contacting, along with the region. And I welcome you. Wish this encounter best its endeavor. Thank you again very much, Brother Syed.
I thank Minister Mansour for his remarks. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we will now move to our panelists, and I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Wesson Ahmad, the Director of the Applied Center for International Law of Al-Haq. He has been working as a human rights advocate with Al-Haq since 2006, where he is also the coordinator of the Business and Human Rights Program. His area of research focuses on the economic incentive structure, perpetuating the colonization of Palestine along business lines. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this initiative. It's an honor to be a part of it. Sha'wan Jabarin, the General Director of Al-Haq, sends his solidarity and apologies that the circumstances did not allow him to be with you today. The recent Israeli Minister of Defense's designation of 6 Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations, followed by military orders along the same lines, may have sent shockwaves throughout the international community. But for those of us working within these organizations, it was no surprise. For years, Israel has been trying to undermine the efforts of Palestinian civil society, standing in the way of its colonial policy without much success in comparison to the amount of resources it has dedicated. Despite the deference given to Israel in its allegations, the international community has not been convinced that Israeli claims are representative of the truth. This failure has led Israel to create its own version of the truth through its power to impose laws which reinforce its narrative with the expectation that the cover of law will force capitulation. The use of such tactics, however, is not new in the historical context of relational dynamics between colonizer and colonized, oppressor and oppressed. From the Americas to Africa and Europe and Asia, similar tactics have been used throughout history to justify persecution and subjugation of those in pursuit of justice, accountability, and truth, in the context of an asymmetrical power balance under the premise that might makes right. The work our organizations do is aimed at bringing the truth about what is happening on the ground to the international community, with the hope that the exposure to the facts as applied to international law would lead to action. Over time, we've developed a more proactive approach towards advocating for the enforcement of international law by targeting the political will of the international community and using the mechanisms that have been developed and designated as the legitimate tools through which the right to self-determination should be pursued. With our refinement in the use of such tools, such as the International Criminal Court, the Convention Against Apartheid, an area of business and human rights, we've been able to challenge Israel's colonial policy by confronting the impunity it enjoys, its narrative of adherence to democratic values and the rule of law, as well as the economic incentive structure facilitating and perpetuating its continued colonization of Palestine. Our success in mounting these challenges have naturally made Israel uncomfortable, with its recent moves simply being an attempt to remove the source of this discomfort and a natural reaction of speaking truth to power. Nevertheless, despite Israel's ability to take direct action against Al-Haq and the other organizations, it has opted for a more indirect approach. This approach makes use of the development of international law around the financing of terrorism, with the expectation that the term alone will instill fear in the international support system of solidarity and the external mechanisms through which it functions, leaving us isolated and unsustainable. By drawing on behavioral psychology, Israel's strategy is to secure the capitulation of those enabling the oppressed to resist the oppressor, not because of conviction and a belief in the truth, rather because of fear. In the behavioral response of fight or flight, Israel is betting on flight. That's because the target is you as members of the international community as much as it is us as representatives of Palestinian civil society. Israel's latest attempt to silence Palestinian civil society is just another tactical move in its colonial strategy, which aims to remove the obstacles in pursuit of such a strategy. This attempt, like others before it, however, is bound to fail because the message is bigger than the messenger it is targeting, and the pursuit of truth is part of human nature that cannot be eradicated. Nevertheless, how far Israel tries to go with these tactics is very much dependent on you, the international community. In physics, Newton's first law of motion is that an object in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Israel's colonial appetite and the imperial mindset driving it is that force, which will continue to push forward unless you, members of the international community, act against it. Israel is testing your resolve with regard to Palestinian civil society in the same way it tests your resolve with its settlement enterprise. If it is only met with words of concern and condemnations, then it will only continue to push further. And it won't stop with the 6, because it will always see those civil society actors serving as an obstacle to its colonial ambitions as a threat. Now, from psychology to physics to economics, members of the international community must act to reconcile their political rhetoric with economic activity and relations with Israel, because Israel has continued to refine colonial practices to develop a best business practice of colonialism in Palestine. Israel's refinement of the means and methods of oppression and control form part of its broader policy in making the continued colonization of Palestine a profitable business venture, which our work aims to challenge. Through the impunity Israel has enjoyed, it has not only been able to exploit the Palestinian population to secure a captive market of consumption, it has also used that same captive population as a laboratory for the research and development of weapons and surveillance technology, which is then marketed and sold around the world as Israeli innovation. The recent discovery of the use of Pegasus spyware to target Palestinian human rights defenders, including the staff of the designated organizations, is a case in point. It cannot be a coincidence that Israel's designation coincided with the discovery of spyware on the device of an Al-Haq staff member. Likewise, it is because of the nature of our work in this context, which triggered the intuitive response of suspicion and investigation that may have been missed otherwise. It is important to note that our concerns were not merely regarding the use of the surveillance technology as such, rather the potential abuse of such technology to fabricate evidence that could be later used as secret evidence, which is immune from objective scrutiny considering the deference given by the Israeli judicial system to its security apparatus. That's why Israel's most recent attack on Palestinian civil society must not only be seen as an attempt to remove the obstacles to Israel's general colonial policy, it must also be seen as a specific attempt to distract us from pursuing the investigation and preemptively undermine our position in the eyes of the international community in order to secure a key component of its economic incentive structure, perpetuating the continued oppression of the Palestinian people and the suppression of the truth. Members of the international community must take action against this attack against civil society, as its persecution of these organizations is part of the crime of apartheid and should not be recognized. And this non-recognition must be expressly made by all members of the international community. In closing, last month, an Israeli official stood at the podium of the UN General Assembly and tore up the annual report of the UN Human Rights Council. This coincides with the first year that Israel is a member of the ECOSOC committee. This action shows us what Israel thinks about the work of human rights defenders and the international human rights regime that has evolved thanks to the sacrifice of so many human rights defenders. In response, I would like to show Israel and the world what I think about its designation and action towards the six. We ask you to stand with us, stand with the six, and not let this go unanswered. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Wesson Ahmad for his remarks. I would now like to give the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, the head of Amnesty International's Office for Israel and Palestine in Jerusalem and the NGOs MENA Deputy Regional Director. He's also an advisor to the Al-Quds University Human Rights Clinic, where he worked as academic coordinator and lecturer. Previously, Mr. Higazi worked as a public relations officer in the office of the Ministry of Planning in Ramallah. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your Excellencies, respected members of the audience, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this event. For years, Palestinian civil society and those who advocate for respect and protection of human rights in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories have been warning about shrinking space. Shrinking space became the term used to describe Israel's policies toward Palestinian civil society actors, policies that restrict and punish those daring to expose Israel's systematic human rights violations and advocate for Israel to be held accountable. The term has also been used to encompass how Palestinian authorities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip have also increased their crackdown on Palestinian civil society actors, including activists and human rights defenders. As a result, human rights activists face repression from both Israeli and Palestinian authorities and often find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. This has been going on for years, despite repeated warnings by civil society actors on the ground and around the world about the dangers of Israel's attacks. Since at least 2015, Israel's governments have escalated intimidation of Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders and activists that call for an end to Israel's systematic violations and for accountability for crimes under international law, including through boycotts as a form of advocacy. Israeli officials have repeatedly threatened, smeared, and stigmatized Israeli human rights defenders and human rights NGOs, demonizing them as foreign agents and traitors, and have failed to protect those who face attacks from Israeli settlers or right-wing activists. Palestinian activists and NGOs engaging with the International Criminal Court's examination of the situation in the OPT have been subjected to the sustained campaign of electronic surveillance within the OPT and further afield, including in The Hague. While Palestinian cultural centers and organizations in Israel and East Jerusalem have been subjected to harassment. The Israeli authorities have also increasingly hindered access for humanitarian workers engaging in advocacy against IHL violations by imposing bureaucratic obstacles. Further, Israel's parliament, the Knesset, adopted legislation that imposes new reporting requirements on organizations that receive funding from foreign governments, almost all of which are human rights groups. In addition, NGOs apparently working in coordination with Israeli officials or are otherwise aligned with Israeli government policy towards Palestinians have intensified their efforts to block the funding of Israeli and Palestinian rights NGOs by demonizing the former as unpatriotic and the later as anti-Semitic or affiliated with terrorist organizations, without proving any credible evidence for any of the claims. Meanwhile, the authorities continue to prosecute Palestinian human rights defenders in military courts in the occupied Palestinian territories, including for organizing peaceful protests against Israel's occupation policies. Over the course of the last couple of years, attacks are intensified, and we are now faced with a situation where legitimate and vital civil society work, including defending human rights, is made criminal. Throughout these years, the strategy of attack against human rights defenders was clear. It starts with smears and attempt of delegitimization, making baseless but loud claims against individuals and organizations. Once these baseless claims catch the listening ear of decision makers in Western countries who engage with the claims without serious and meaningful questioning, then the attack is escalated to try and stop the funding and support provided for civil society on the ground. It is precisely because these attacks were allowed to continue unimpeded at the same time that Israel is allowed to continue with systematic violations under international law with impunity that we are where we are today. Shrinking space is no longer a valid term. We are now facing attempts to close the space entirely. The recent designation of the 6 organizations, including leading human rights groups, as terrorist organizations is a very dangerous advancement in Israel's attacks against Palestinian civil society. But it is also not new. Such attempts to criminalize legitimate and vital human rights work and the people and the organizations carrying it out has been going on for a while now. Earlier this year, Israel designated the Health Workers Committees, one of the major organizations providing vital health services in the OPT, as a terrorist organization, and then moved to close down its headquarters in Ramallah and arrested members of its staff, including the director of the organization, human rights defender Shada Aoudeh, who is currently in prison. These designations and the actions that follow are based on secret information that not the groups nor their legal representatives are able to see or challenge. Secret information is widely used to restrict and or attack the rights of Palestinians, including human rights defenders and groups. It is used in the recent attempt to criminalize the 6 organizations and others. It is used in detaining human rights defenders without charge or trial and to restrict the freedom of movement. It is so widely used because Israel enjoys being able to carry out such policies without question, let alone accountability. And here is the main point. While none of the world powers that uphold principles of rule of law and human rights are confronting Israel's impunity, let alone hold it accountable for violations under international law, these human rights defenders on the ground are pushing the other way. Expose Israel's violation and advocate for accountability, whether by pushing third states to uphold the responsibility or through the International Criminal Court or through the UN mechanisms. The organizations that Israel criminalized and their staff face real and imminent threats, including closure of offices, arrest and detention of staff, the confiscation of assets, and suspension of crucial funding that allows them to work. This is a real danger with wide implications, including for the work of international organizations like ourselves. Because at the time when Israel also works to restrict the work of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, it also prevents UN human rights monitors access to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, making the work of local human rights defenders ever more vital and requiring meaningful and strong support from us all. But let us be clear, it is already very dangerous to be carrying out human rights work in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. In past years, human rights defenders have been detained, injured, and some have been killed while carrying out their work. Moving to criminalize this work just adds to an already deadly mix. The strategic danger is where space for human rights work is shut down almost completely. The risk is that the patterns of human rights that are continuously exposed because of the work of local human rights groups are no longer visible and eventually normalized. This will result in a situation where the rule of law and respect for human rights becomes relevant only to certain areas around the world, but not others. A situation of black holes of impunity that will work to undermine the international system we are all working to preserve. The situation requires immediate and decisive action. First, expose Israel's recent actions for what they really are, an attack against human rights defenders with implications for the wider international human rights movement. We must ensure that support, both political and financial, to Palestinian civil society continues, allowing it sustainability and ability to protect itself from attacks. This includes making clear that Israel's terrorist designation of the 6 organizations and others are arbitrary, baseless, and should not be considered by states, donor agencies, or financial institutions. Must ultimately ensure that Israel and Israeli nationals are held accountable for violations under international law by supporting ongoing investigations by the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, and pressuring Israel to allow international investigators and human rights monitors in. We must make clear that the era of impunity is over. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Higazi for his briefing. Our third speaker in this panel is Mr. Omar Shakir, the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. He investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Prior to his current role, he was a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Right. Mr. Omar Shakir, now you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Excellencies and representatives that are joining us for today's conversation. The merits of today's topic go far beyond the contours of Israel and Palestine. Indeed, the Israeli government's designation of 6 prominent Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations and subsequent maneuvers by Israeli authorities, military authorities to outlaw these organizations represent a frontal assault on the international human rights movement, and how the international community responds will be a true test of its resolve to protect human rights defenders across the globe. As my colleague and friend Wessam noted in the beginning of his presentation, this decision did not come out of nowhere. It is an escalation and a prolonged campaign by the Israeli government to muzzle human rights advocacy. That campaign has involved a series of different maneuvers, some of which my colleague and friend Saleh Hijazi also laid out. It includes efforts, of course, to deny entry to international human rights activists, to deport some of those in country. It includes efforts to malign and attack Israeli human rights advocates. It includes efforts to restrict the speech and activities of international human rights activists across the globe using a network of pro-government, non-governmental organizations, and often with the support of the Israeli government itself. But let's be clear. Palestinians have always borne the brunt of that repression. For years, and in fact for decades, Palestinian human rights defenders have faced raids on their offices, have faced punitive travel bans, and even arrest and criminal charges. For far too long, the response of the international community to all these actions has been inaction. The response was paltry even when these circumstances, to a much lesser degree, affected representatives of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. When the Israeli government deported me 2 years ago, we warned the international community that if it failed to act then, in a matter of months or years, we could be facing a situation where local civil society groups have been outlawed. That's where we are today. Where we will be in 2 years will depend on how the international community reacts today. After Human Rights Watch said this, Amnesty International made similar calls when a staff member of theirs, a Palestinian staff member of theirs, faced a punitive travel ban that prevented him from being by his mother as she passed away from cancer kilometers away in occupied East Jerusalem, or to leave the country. And again, it was met with inaction. And of course, when these events have affected Palestinians, the inaction has been even greater, and sometimes even led to a situation where condemnations are not forthcoming. Of course, this stems from a much larger issue. The Israeli government's designation stems from them being emboldened by decades of impunity for grave human rights abuses, including the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Indeed, if the international community lacks the resolve to protect those documenting human rights abuses, how will it ever stop human rights abuse in the first place? As Saleh also mentioned, the attack on human rights defenders stems from a decades-long reality where the Israeli government has imposed laws and policies and practices that deprive Palestinians of their basic rights, including their basic civil rights, the right to freedom of association, assembly, and expression. If the international community wants a different outcome this time, it's going to need a different approach. The Israeli government has made a bet. It is banking on the fact that the international community will rely on the same playbook it's used when settlements are expanded and where other human rights abuses have taken place, where the international community may issue a statement, may or may not be a strong one, but eventually will move on and will accept the status quo as a fait accompli. In this case, we're already seeing that playbook bear out. At first, international governments responded by saying, we need to see the evidence. Here we are, 6 weeks later, there is no evidence. But we've yet to see many countries in the international community call out that reality for what it is. It's time to move beyond speaking of evidence. It's time to move beyond this idea that, well, so long as the Israeli government doesn't act on this, it's okay. We need to move beyond accepting this as a reality. It's critical that the international community call this out and act on this behalf. Let me conclude with 5 recommendations, clear and concrete things that the international community should do today to ensure that these designations, these maneuvers don't lead to the in practice outlawing of these organizations. First, they need to condemn clearly and unequivocally these maneuvers and call for them to be immediately rescinded. Secondly, the governments must make clear that they consider the Israeli government's designations null and void and without legal effect, and convey that message to donors and other actors. Thirdly, governments should meet with representatives of the 6 organizations at the highest level and in country and convey their support for them in their work. Fourth, if the Israeli government fails to immediately rescind these designations, they should impose countermeasures. Words will not suffice. Fifth and finally, governments must link these attacks on human rights defenders to the larger context against which this takes place. And that context includes at its heart the Israeli government's crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Apartheid is the reality for millions of Palestinians, and it's time the international community recognized that reality for what it is. In closing, let me say that these 6 organizations not only represent the best of Palestinian civil society, they represent the best of global civil society. They have long been models to countries across the globe. They include people that serve on our boards, our closest partners, our closest allies. An attack against them is an attack against each of us that is concerned about international law and human rights. Let's be fully clear about what's happening here. This is an existential threat to Palestinian civil society. This is an existential threat to human rights reporting in Israel and Palestine. Act now before it's too late. Thank you.
Mr. Shakir, thank you for your remarks. I now welcome Mr. Michael Sfard, an Israeli lawyer and political activist specializing in international human rights law and the laws of war. He has served as counsel in various cases on these topics in Israel, where he has represented a variety of Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, movements, and activists before the Israeli Supreme Court. He has brought many cases to challenge the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory and represented hundreds of Israeli soldiers who have refused to serve in the OPT. Mr. Sfard and his law office provide legal counsel for the Israeli human rights NGO, Yesh Din, and he is a legal counsel for peace now. Mr. Sfard, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, distinguished Ambassador Aidid and distinguished Ambassador Mansour, my fellow panelists, members of the audience, representatives. Almost 7 weeks have passed since Israel has designated 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, including some of the most famous, well-respected, and veteran Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations. Almost 7 weeks have passed, and Israel has failed to present to the public, to the Israeli public, to the Palestinian public, to the international community, any shred of evidence of its allegations. Almost 7 weeks have passed, and the international community, while we heard some condemnations and statements of concern, has not taken a clear act in response to this worrying and watershed moment in the history of Israeli targeting Palestinian civil society. Excellencies, the history of the Israeli targeting of Palestinian human rights community and Israeli human rights community was well described by my friends and colleagues that spoke before me. But the specific history of targeting these specific Palestinian human rights organizations that have been designated exposes the real motivation behind the designation. As said before me, the designation did not come out of the blue. The designation are the peak of a stream, years of targeting these organizations by different means, and specifically by trying to dry out their funds, by convincing their governmental, mainly European donors, to stop supporting them in order for them to be silenced by economic suffocation. The concern that the Israeli government had about these organizations was always their legal advocacy and their public advocacy in international institutions, and mainly the facilitation they provide to the work of the International Criminal Court. The Israeli government has ascribed to the investigation handled by the International Criminal Court as a strategic threat to its policies, and thus silencing and curbing the organizations that assist and facilitate these investigations has become a strategic aim for the government of Israel. The failure to convince the supporting governments to stop their work with these organizations has brought about the violent act of the designation. Now, have no doubt about it. Under Israeli law and under the military Israeli law that prevails in the West Bank, the designation of an entity as a terrorist organization is the NGO equivalent of the death penalty. It's a legal execution. Such a designation invokes a set of administrative powers, radical draconian administrative powers, and prohibitions, the violations of which are criminal, that are aimed at forcing the seclusion of the designated entity and eventually its annihilation. Of course, Israel is using these powers selectively and sometimes arbitrarily when it fits its goals, interests, and the timing is ripe. And so even if we have not seen in the last almost 7 weeks a raid on the offices of the designated entities, the closure of their offices, the arrest of their volunteers, the detention of their executives and board members, even if we have not seen the confiscation of the organization's properties, that does not mean it will not happen tomorrow. And more importantly, when Israel wishes, and I think this is the most clear goal that the designation was a place to achieve, to block any transfers of resources to the Ramallah bank accounts of these organizations, now it is able to do it. It does not need anymore to convince the donors to stop donating. It can simply block the transfers and expropriate the resources as proceeds of terror. Israel has also abused the term terrorism on the way, because the Israeli counterterrorism law has a definition of terrorist organization that is wide and can, and in fact does, swallow the entire Palestinian society, that is a society that fights for its freedom and independence. Because if terror organization is defined not only as an entity that carries out acts of terror, but also as an entity that provides services to or has links to an organization that was previously designated, there is a potential of recursiveness that indeed creates an infectious disease of guilt by association. And that is exactly what we've seen here. The type of evidence that was presented to the public is really embarrassing. It is trying to convince the international community that these organizations that have an immense record of working for hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries, securing their rights and their freedoms, are terrorist organizations because they have, because of guilt by association of people who were working for them or have in the past been under administrative detention and things of that sort. This is absolutely infuriating. Excellencies, ambassadors, and members of the public of the audience, on Friday, we will all indicate the International Human Rights Day, 76 years after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was signed. The day before, on Thursday, we will indicate 23 years to the signing of the UN General Assembly Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders. The framers of the Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders understood that without defenders of human rights, there are no human rights. That without defenders, it is easy for tyrants to violate, to breach with impunity human rights. This is the story we're seeing now in Israel. It's the old story of silencing dissenting voices, silencing criticism, and making sure that investigations, like the International Criminal Court's investigation, that is aimed at creating some accountability for the crimes committed by the Israeli regime in the occupied Palestinian territories, will not go unpunished, try to block it, to frustrate it by silencing those who aid it. Distinguished ambassadors and excellencies, it is a watershed moment, not because the Israeli occupation has not done worse things. It has. It killed people. It maimed people. It forcibly removed whole communities and transferred them, deported them. However, there is something about the designation of these 6 Palestinian civil society groups, who are the backbone of Palestinian civil society, that has some boldness in it. As my friend, dear friend and colleague, Omar Shakir said before, it's a bet. It's a bet that Israel has taken. The Israeli government climbed a high mountain. At the beginning, it was quite windy up there, but now it waits for the wind to subside. We should not allow it to subside. We should not allow this bet to bear any fruits. And for that, I will not repeat the recommendations made by the previous speakers. I will just say the international community, and mainly members of the international community who have been supporting these organizations in the past, have to make a pledge, a public pledge, that they will continue to support these organizations. They expect Israel not to block their taxpayers' money when they pass it, for these organizations to continue their work in securing human rights in Palestine. I hope that this bet will show future tyrants, future dictators, that this blueprint that Israel has created on how to silence civil society is not working. Because if it does work, we will see these acts being carried out in many other places. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Sfard for sharing your perspective on the issue. We have been very efficient with regard to time management, so we have a few more minutes for Q&A. So now I would like to open the floor for questions to all our panelists from the member states. Express the wish to ask questions, and then we will turn to the speakers for their answers. I would like to kindly request that member states focus their interventions on questions to the speakers to elicit more insights or deliberation on the perspectives and recommendations for our collective action. Do we have anyone requesting for the floor?
Ambassador, if I may take the floor just to try to get the Q&A started.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Reda, please.
Palestine. Thank you to the 4 very distinguished speakers for their very clear and compelling presentations to the committee today. I think that the the points that you have made have not only been well received, but the hope is that they will motivate everyone to act, to continue taking this seriously. I would underscore a point that was made by all four of the speakers, that Israel, as the occupying power in doing this, is betting on the international community reacting very strongly at first, but then moving on, forgetting. And I think that it's important to underline that this can't be brushed aside, that the seriousness of this and that the lingering and long-term impact of this designation can really cripple the work of Palestinian civil society organizations, silence their exposure of Israel's crimes, and undermine their advocacy on behalf of the rights and freedoms of our people. And so I think that I would like to further underscore the recommendations that have been made by all of you and detailed in the 5 points by Omar. If I could just ask, more specifically in connection with the calls for accountability and efforts for accountability, what the speakers would recommend that states at this moment in time, what steps they should undertake. So again, bearing in mind the recommendations that have been made in regards to defending these 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, but connecting that to accountability measures in the larger context of holding Israel accountable for its crimes and violations against the Palestinian people throughout occupied Palestine, including East Jerusalem. Specific measures that the distinguished panelists would recommend that states consider undertaking as soon as possible, either individually or collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Frida, for the questions. Maybe I would also like to first state the commitment of Malaysia with regard to the issue. We have issued a condemnation on the listing of the 6 NGOs, and we'll continue to speak on this issue. But if I may ask a question as well, more with regard to the feedback that you have been getting from your fellow international CSOs and relevant donors with regard to the listing, and how are they looking at it, and to tie it with your recommendations. Thank you. Since I do not have any other speakers asking for the floor now, may I invite comments from all?
May I say?
Sorry, but there yet. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Syed. I hope that other colleagues, members of the committee and other ambassadors who are with us, to share with us any ideas that they have in mind. But let me just say to the 4 distinguished colleagues that we will discuss in the Bureau of the committee and the committee in general the proposals that you have put forward. And let me also add that one possible idea that we will discuss thoroughly to go back to the tradition that we had before the COVID hit us, of having an annual conference of all civil society organizations on the approved list of the committee. There are, I think, Elio can correct me, more than 600-700 of them, to invite maybe to have a special conference here at the UN, in which number of leaders such as Sha'wan and maybe others, we invited the speakers. If we can do it in person, would be wonderful. If not, some hybrid, person and virtual, to elevate the outrage of the international community, what the Israeli occupying authorities have done and doing, and to double down on our defense of these 6 organizations as a defense of all international organizations, as you have said, working in the civil society domain, the area of human rights, so that we do not accept only what we have done so far. We appreciate, but it's not sufficient. We need to shift gears and to try to do something more. And perhaps this idea we will discuss. I promise you, I will raise it in the meeting of the Bureau as soon as possible to see if we can, collaboration with you and many others, that we can very soon, as soon as possible and practical, to convene such conference, make it open for representatives of all governments, and to see if Madame Bachelet and others from human rights would be interested in partnering with us in that kind of a conference, so that as we move forward and as the Israeli occupying authority keep adjusting to invent a new playbook to silence those who are active in the human rights domain, we have also to adjust and to correct our march and present 2 practical steps within our domain and capabilities to resist this onslaught and to defend all those who are in the field defending human rights of the Palestinian people. It's just a thought, Brother Syed Mohamad, I want to put on the table that I promise that we will discuss it in our very soon meeting of the Bureau in light of suggestions and the recommendations that you have suggested. I wanted to say that before you give them back the floor, to suggest, whatever they have in mind, as FIDA asked them and as you asked them. And if there are other suggestions from colleagues from different member states of the observer states, so that they can share with us additional ideas if they have. Thank you. Hassan.
Thank you, Minister Mansour, for your comments and suggestions. So may I now invite the panelists to give their comments on the questions and suggestions so far. Maybe we could start with Mr. Wesson Ahmad, and then followed by Mr. Saleh Hijazi, Mr. Omar Shakir, then Mr. Michael Sfard. So may I invite Mr. Wesson first.
Sure. Thank you very much for the questions. And obviously, the best way to respond to attempts at silencing the messenger is to amplify and implement the message. And the work of these Palestinian civil society organizations has long been calling for action and enforcement of international law towards Israel. And Israel is betting that its actions will remain in a binary relationship between it and Palestinian civil society. The international community must respond with a systemic counter-response that addresses Israel's actions in various levels. For example, the EU Horizon Agreement and its cooperation with Israel with regard to research and development. This is one of the things that needs to be addressed and challenged and suspended, because it requires an inquiry into how Israel is using such research cooperation to develop such technology that could later be used to attack human rights defenders and then marketed abroad as well, impacting human rights defenders in other parts of the world as well. This is a very serious concern that the EU should take and address, and not simply allow business as usual to go in other areas where Israel sees that these things are disconnected. We have to show that everything is connected. Supporting the process at the ICC, taking measures to ban settlement products, the support of the UN database on business enterprises involved in the settlement enterprise. These are all actions that we have been calling for, and the response to attempts to silence us should be met with the implementation of those calls to show Israel that it will not succeed in silencing the message. With regard to the issue of the support that we have gotten from our partners, that's what has been really energizing us and keeping us going, because the response has been so positive. And it, the people that support Palestinian civil society organizations know very well that they aren't simply engaged in the business of human rights. They aren't taking the path of least resistance. And that's why the partners that we have are standing with us and continue to stand by us. And we expect others to join and reinforce that support and have Israel regret taking this move, because we want our message to be amplified and supported further. And a final point, and this may be something that can be explored, is Israel's membership in the ECOSOC committee, I think, is something that needs to be challenged at that level as well, considering the relationship that that committee plays with civil society. And I think Israel cannot be allowed to conduct business as usual in other parts of the UN, while it completely disregards the work of UN human rights defenders on the floor of the General Assembly. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Wesson Ahmad, for your feedback. May I now invite Mr. Saleh Hijazi for your comments, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Basically reiterate what has been said previously by my colleagues on the immediate level. The words need to be translated into action. So yes, condemnation is good, but then there needs to be a very clear call that Israel must rescind this designation or otherwise face consequences. I want to also refer back to the briefing by the High Commissioner, Madame Bachelet. She ended her briefing just before our session by saying that the numerous resolutions at the UN Security Council, at the Human Rights Council level, must be turned from just mere resolutions to reality on the ground. We have two very important investigations happening. And this is because of the work of some of the organizations that have been recently criminalized. One is the International Criminal Court investigation. It must be supported. It must be protected against attacks. And the Commission of Inquiry that was set up by the Human Rights Council in May, which is, again, referring back to Madame Bachelet's briefing, is very so crucial because, one, it is not town-bound, but also, I may underline that it also looks at not only the OPT, but also Israel, and has in its mandate included the addressing of the root causes, which everybody should be focused on. This is what the 6 organizations are pointing to, and as my colleague Wessam was saying, emphasize, not only what's happening to the messenger, but also the message that they have been carrying. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. May I now invite Mr. Omar Shakir to give his reflection on the questions.
Thank you, and it's hard to add to anything that Saleh and Wessam said. I think they covered everything. I would just add a couple of small things. One is even in a specific relation to the 6. we haven't seen governments even summon Israeli ambassadors, for the large part for questioning. I mean, that's a pretty, basic step that can be taken. So I think even at the level of performative outrage, we haven't seen European governments do that. And again, there are precedents here. Many are familiar with the case of Mohamad al-Halabi from World Vision, who's been prosecuted for 5+ years. Again, we saw some statements of outrage, really outlandish claims, reports that debunked them, and then, people forgot about it and really stopped touching the case. And I think that's, again, going back to the theme of bets of the Israeli government. That's the worry here. So I think you need to see states take action, right? And I think there's a worry, there's a genuine concern that now that this isn't in the headlines every day. I mean, we had the event, the Pegasus, we had the declaration, the military order. It's been a few weeks, we're heading into the holidays. So I think there's a real concern now. So there's a need for states to really take coordinated action. It starts, as noted, with stronger statements, performative actions like the ambassadors, and ultimately countermeasures. And there are a number of those that can be taken. But I think a key point that I want to add is it's not enough if Israel says we're not going to act on today, but it acts tomorrow. And that's the scenario that we worry about. As Sfard said so well, they're waiting for the wind to die out. So we need to keep it as windy as possible. And maybe the wind is strong enough that they come down from that hill or that mountain they put themselves on. In terms of the larger, recommendations to the question in terms of accountability and impunity, I would just add to what Wessam and Saleh said by saying, especially talking to a UN forum, is the importance of recognizing Israeli apartheid, to recognize reality for what it is. That, every UN statement on Israel-Palestine should highlight this reality. We need to be able to, if you don't correctly diagnose the problem, you can't solve it. And this is something that, again, we know that that members of the committee and otherwise are states that have stronger records, but it's important that even those states use this terminology, highlight it, because, once you have acceptance of the reality for what it is, it's much easier to then make progress on a situation, that a peace process will quickly solve, but a situation of grave and systemic rights abuse and apartheid and persecution. One other very specific rec I would make, and this is in Human Rights Watch's April report, is for the UN to establish, a global envoy, a body for the crimes of apartheid and persecution, with a mandate to pursue the end of these crimes wherever they take place, and not only in Israel-Palestine, but in other global situations as well, where there could be a similar, determination made. That person could help ensure prosecution and otherwise of these crimes. So I think that's a really practical step, that states could take. Otherwise, I would echo, what Saleh and Wessam said about the ICC, the database, the Commission of Inquiry. But really, if you're recognizing apartheid, moving forward on the committee, are really important steps that I would just add.
Thank you, Mr. Omar Shakir, for all those important points. May I now invite Mr. Sfard. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, having three wise panelists speaking before me, they left very little for me and did most of the work. I will add a very short ideas. First of all, for me, it seems that as time passes and Israel does not show any evidence, and it will not show any evidence, the alternative explanation, which I laid down, that this is in fact an act of obstruction of justice, is something that has to be pursued. I haven't looked into all the legal avenues that this thing can be pursued. It couldn't be pursued in the ICC. It could be a kind of inquiry that is UN-led inquiry, but taken together, the designations and the NSO fiasco, and all other things that are associated with targeting these organizations in relation to their work with the ICC, I think at least raising this as a serious alternative explanation to the designation is something that has to be done or could be done and will be helpful. Second thing is, I think the designations have been done in order to silence the organizations and their messages. So we need to amplify their messages. We need to provide them with a stage and to show that not only that the designations have not created the goal or the end that it was meant to achieve, but quite the opposite. That now, because of the designations, these organizations have bigger audience, bigger stages, more important place arenas to present their messages, to present their criticism and their reports and their researches. So amplifying their messages is something that should be done, and again, will also not only help in the quest to reverse the designations, but also will help in making future potential designators think twice before they take such a step. And I repeat everything that was said before me. I think the ideas are there. They just have to be followed. One last word. Miss Abdelhadi asked about, I think I heard her asking about what do we hear from the international community. And I have to say that my feeling, and it's a matter for concern, is that everybody is waiting. Everyone is waiting for something to happen. Now, nothing will happen if no one will do something. We have to do something for something to happen. Otherwise, this is exactly the Israeli strategy of waiting for the news cycle to be over and to make the idea that human rights organizations, real, well-respected human rights organizations are terrorist organizations. This idea becomes normalized. We should not allow it to be normalized. It's not only a crime against those organizations, against the Palestinian people, against the international human rights community. It's also a crime against the fight against terrorism. Just like Israel has cheapened the term anti-Semitism, and that way damaged the important fight to eradicate anti-Semitism, it now does the same thing with terrorism. We should not allow it to happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Michael Sfard, for your comment. I don't see any other requests for the floor from member states or the larger audience. So I think with that, I would like to thank you for your intervention and comments so far. So before proceeding further, may I now invite all of you to give your concluding remarks from each panelist. Maybe we start with now with Mr. Michael, and then to be followed by Mr. Omar Shakir and Saleh Hijazi and Mr. Wesson Ahmad. Over to you, Mr. Michael Sfard.
Well, I think first of all, I want to thank you, the organizers of this event. I think it's important that this event is happening. I think it's important that we have representatives of the international community, of members of this committee. I think it's important that we will discuss ways to counter the targeting of Palestinian civil society. And I thank you very much also for the opportunity to be part of this. As an Israeli lawyer, I feel it's a privilege that I'm part of this very just struggle. And I really don't have much more to add except reiterate. At the end of the day, the power to make these designations fail, to make them fail and not achieve the goal that was meant for them, rests not with private individuals and not with private foundations. It rests with state actors. It's a state that has done this thing, and these are states that can counter it. For private actors, it is very complicated to take action that counters these designations. It may cost them both in legal terms and in monetary terms. So the international community, states that are members in the UN, EU members that have been supporting these organizations for many years, have been cultivating these organizations for many years, have to take action, because otherwise it will be very difficult to convince the Israeli government to retract the designations. And if we will not take a step, and this is really a warning, in several months, maybe a year, these organizations will either cease to exist or will exist in a completely different form. They are organizations that work according to the international auditing system, in the international banking system. And if Israel blocks their funding, they have a problem how to continue existing. So we have here a ticking bomb. We have to take action now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Sfard, for your concluding remarks. But I just received one question from the larger audience. So before I proceed with the rest of the panelists making their concluding remarks, let me read these questions to you. The question is, I agree that we must address the root cause of this illegality by ending the occupation. However, what would you suggest to other activists from outside of Palestine to help support and defend these human rights defenders? How can we use social media and the media in general to overt what is being done to the Sikhs and essentially what will be done to the others? Thank you. The question was from Ms. Nadia Ghanam, Advisor on Media Affairs at the Mission of the State of Palestine to the United Nations. So I present the questions to all the panelists who would like to begin first. If there is no other, then I will use my dictator power to ask. Sometimes democracy doesn't work. So maybe I ask Mr. Saleh Hijazi first, perhaps to comment on that.
Thank you, Ambassador. I guess I'll use the answer to the question to also kind of put forth my concluding remarks. And so, because it does relate to what has been said, by dear colleagues, and has been repeated in that there is a responsibility on the states present here and others that are members of the UN to take decisive and immediate action against this move and against the impunity that Israel enjoys. And therefore, when it comes to members of the public in other countries, is to ensure that the governments are taking that decisive and immediate action to hold them accountable then for when things are let without any action from their governments. There is a responsibility here. There's a real danger. As I was saying in my intervention, the shrinking of the space is turning into a complete closure of the space. This is what we're witnessing here. And without the action, as my colleague, Mr. Sfard was saying, without the action from states, and not only groups and individuals, we're going to see this happen very, very soon. So action and action now, and for anybody who's concerned with human rights and Palestinian civil society, they must ensure that their governments are taking that action or are sustaining that action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, for answering the question and presenting your concluding remarks. I think we will proceed with that in that order. So maybe Mr. Omar Shakir can do the same. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. What I wanted to say is similar to what Michael Sfard said in his concluding remarks. I mean, Al-Haq, for example, has been around for more than 4 decades. Many of us stood in Ramallah a couple of years ago commemorating that, landmark, moment. There have been academic pieces written about, their work, pioneering work in the global South and their human rights work. The 6 organizations include, groups that work on prisoners' rights, a group Amir, groups that work on the rights of children, groups that deal with agricultural workers, with the rights of women. I mean, you're really talking about the bedrock, the foundation, of civil society here. And I think, why this should matter, to the international community is once the Israeli government has set that precedent, that their work is terrorism. And let's be clear, that's what this is, that means that eventually the work that Michael Sfard does, the work that Israeli human rights groups, the work that international groups, all of it is also terrorism. I mean, one, quite literally, the designation would mean our support, our participation in this event, would fall afoul, of that requirement. Much more generally, they're being penalized, for precisely the type of work that is the foundation of global human rights advocacy and work. So I think the implications are much more stark and much more significant. A couple of weeks ago, my colleague who covers China and I wrote a piece in Al Jazeera comparing the tactics that have been used, in the treatment of Uyghurs and the way that the Israeli government has treated Palestinians, mostly focused on mass surveillance, but also, treating human rights advocacy and dissent as terrorism. So we're talking about much more bigger, international issues. I know that, sometimes folks, express concern that Israel-Palestine gets so much of the focus in places like the UN. But I think it precisely is necessary in cases like this because the implications of the precedent here is so much larger. And so often when international principles are put to the crucible test, and your few harder crucible tests in Israel-Palestine, it has failed Israel-Palestine. And this is quite simply it. So many countries lack the backbone and resolve to act on underlying human rights issues, but claim to support human rights defenders. I've heard this from diplomats for years. Listen, Omar, we can't do much on X, Y, or Z issues, but anything about human rights defenders, we're ready. Well, this is your opportunity. This is the chance to do something. If you can't at least, if you can't make progress to help combat apartheid, to help combat Israel's systematic rights abuse, to help combat, the situation on the ground, at the very least, help take steps to leave space available. And as Saleh pointed out, it's not shrinking, it's closing. At least take the steps and measures that allow groups on the ground to do their work. Because when you shut that down, the implications are much larger. As I noted, and I'll end with this point, if international communities lack the resolve, to allow human rights defenders to document human rights abuse, how will you ever stop human rights abuse?
Thank you. Very well put. I would now like to invite Mr. Wesson Ahmad for the comments and his concluding remarks. Over to you, please.
Thank you again for the opportunity. And I think my concluding remark is more a question of what the consequences would be if these actions are allowed to stand for the up-and-coming generation that wants to study international human rights law, wants to engage in the UN human rights system, wants to use these tools that we have been engaged with for so many years. If the message that is sent is that ultimately your ability to use these tools in a way that causes change leads to your designation as a terrorist group, then what motivation will there be for others to follow suit and study human rights and engage in these mechanisms? And so I think the impact and the ripple effect of these designations goes far beyond our organizations. It undermines faith in the international human rights regime that has been developed over decades. If it has a purpose to reach the normative aspirations, it needs to be reinforced when it works, not have those that are engaged with it successfully to be excluded. So that's the main concern I have about those future generations that are coming in that want to follow in the steps of these organizations and the work they have done through these mechanisms. Will they decide against it? And then if they do, what is the other path that they will take? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wesson Ahmad. I would like to thank all our panelists today, Mr. Wesson Ahmad, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, Mr. Sfard, and Mr. Omar Shakir, for taking the time to participate in this session, sharing your perspective, your useful, very important points and interventions and inputs, as well as your recommendations. I can assure you that this is something that the committee will take seriously and consider further on what are the next steps that we would take. I can mention here that that the wind on top of the mountain, I think we will keep that blowing, not only on top of the mountain, but also at the foot of the mountain with the support of everyone, especially by our CSOs. And with that, that concludes today's event. I would like to thank all the members and observers of the committee, our partners in civil society, and the public at large for attending. A chair summary of this event will be prepared by the Division for Palestinian Rights and will be posted alongside a video recording of this event on the committee's website, unispal.un.org. I hereby declare closed the virtual event supporting human rights defenders in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, reality, challenges, and obligations. Thank you. The session is adjourned. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, colleagues.